Hi, welcome to Brush and Needle Northwest and my cozy corner of the internet. My name is Pam and let's just jump right in to a design along. We're going to design together a cable knit sweater. Now, why would we want to do something like that? Well, I have found that in designing that I not only will I have a sweater my own way and designed to specifications or something that I really enjoy, but I've also learned that it helps me with fit, etc. And if I'm knitting somebody else's pattern and I want to change something, having and knowing design principles and garment construction helps to be able to figure out how to go about changing that to make it my own from what somebody else has started. So I think that, designing going forward is just another tool in our knitting bag to be able to use and go through things. So as I mentioned, designing it's important and will help with all of our knitting and important for our knitting bag, not only for fit, but to change an existing pattern, to design something your own that you are dreaming about or thinking about, and also to understand garment construction. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the why of design. The next thing we need to think about is who it is going to be for. In my particular case, I am designing this sweater for my youngest son, and it's not going to be a surprise for him, although it is going to be a Christmas present. And since he's my tech editor and has picked the yarn and helped me figure out how he wanted it to be done, it's really not going to be a surprise, but it'll be a nice gift when he gets to open the package under the Christmas tree. And it could be a sweater for yourself. It could be a sweater for a significant other or family member, friend, whoever you want to do it for. But don't ever forget about the rule that says if you have a boyfriend and you knit him a sweater, it is like the kiss of death. Now, I think that's just rumor, but I think it's funny. I am long past that stage. So for me, it's going to be my son. The next thing to think about is how will it be worn? In my case, I know that he will wear it quite a bit. It gets quite cool here in the Northwest in the wintertime, so it'll be perfect for it. I also know that he is not going to dry clean or hand wash a sweater, so that tells me that I need to use a yarn that can be washed and is easy to maintain. Also, he will wear it quite a bit, so it needs to be strong construction. So let's start first by thinking about the tools that we'll need to design this sweater. The first thing that you will need is a tape measure. In this video in a little bit, I will be going through all the measurements that you need to take so we have a sweater that fits whoever it is that you're making the sweater for. And the key to that is a good tape measure. You will also need a ruler, and I use a gauge and needle measure ruler also for when I get to the gauge portion. You will need various knitting needles, and I will talk in a couple minutes about how to determine which ones you want. I am going to knit this sweater in pieces and then sew it together, but I will still use circular needles. But however, you can knit it however, whatever needles work for you. I have used straights. Most everything I knit these days are on circular needles. And then my favorite needles are the ChowGoo red lace circulars. I use those for socks for pretty much everything that I do. Or if you like a wood needle better, I use the brand, I think it's pronounced Lykke, Lykke. I like their driftwood. The only thing I don't care for is I have sat on them or squished my knitting bag and broken them, and it always makes me sad. So I don't use them as often, but if I am going to use a wooden needle, that is what I use. The next thing you need are some cable needles. This cable needle is my favorite. However, there are other types. This is another one. I have used these for me, and it will just completely depend on your knitting. Use whatever you like to do cables with. I always end up dropping stitches off this one, so which is why I learned with this one. I've tried the others and I just keep coming back to it. So this is my favorite. This is the one I use most of the time, but I have some very thin ones also that I use if I'm using cables on socks. You will need stitch markers. any kind of stitch markers. I like these. However, the other thing I enjoy doing is the colored ones. I'll use a different color at the beginning or at the end, or certain types of cables, etc. And so it just kind of makes it fun, and it's also another way for me to designate the pattern and makes it a little bit easier along the lines of knitting. Paper and pencil for designing, for making notes. I take copious notes when I knit in the event that I want to do something over again. Also, if I'm doing two, like say a pair of socks, if I take good notes on the first one, the second one is very easy to just go ahead and knit the same way. A few other tools you may need is a barber cord. These are sold in all sorts of different lengths. You can find them on the internet. I would suggest looking at your local yarn store or online at a yarn store. This one's shorter. I use these when I'm knitting a sweater. You can put, they're hollow, so you attach your needle to it and you can switch the stitches over to it and be able to try it on as you go. And that's always very important when you're designing a sweater, when you're knitting a sweater or any other garment that you're using. I like the bright color because I can see it usually against whatever I'm knitting, but you can use whatever you want. One of the things that is going to be an important thing to have or have access to is, for this particular sweater, is some the Aran stitches, the cable stitches varieties. This one is my favorite. Some of these I've had forever and they're out of print. However, you can find them online at used bookstores. There's Abe Books, Thrift Books, sometimes potentially Amazon. Sometimes some of our local knitting stores will have older books. But these have all different stitches, cables in them. And that will be important when you start to design your sweater. You need to find some cables that you like. This is also the Harmony Guide, Aran Stitches. This one is actually a newer book. You might be able to get it by Leisure Arts. There are all sorts of knit dictionaries. I don't buy a lot of knitting books anymore that are just patterns. Typically, I buy things like this, whether they're lace patterns, cable patterns, Scandinavian patterns, intarsia, etc., so I can use the most motifs to design something myself. So if you truly are wanting to begin to design more of your own things, that is one of the things to start looking for and collecting, depending on what style of knitting you wish to have. The internet also, as we all know, is a huge resource for finding things. Another place that I completely forgot to tell you about, for your local library, a lot of times may have cable or stitch books available that you might be able to check out and look at what you like, and you can always take a picture of that and make sure you have the instructions for how to do it and go with it from there. But there's tons of resources out there. I want to go back for just a second to my comment about the paper and pencil. I am a paper and pencil girl. I know that there are a lot of different things on the internet that will help as far as designing and laying patterns out. And if you know and understand how to use them, please use whatever is comfortable for you. As I said, I am a paper and pencil girl. I have said for years that the internet, electronics is gonna kill me. I just don't get them. And so for me, the paper and pencil and actually being able to see and erase and everything else works for me. So that's what I am going to do. However, please, again, use what you are comfortable using. The next thing I want to talk about is measurements. You'll be taking a lot of different measurements of whoever it is that you are designing this sweater for. If it's yourself, that's easy. You're right there. You can take your tape measure and get started. If it's somebody else, if you want it to be a surprise, you might want to figure out, if it's a child that lives in your home, etc., figure out one of their favorite sweaters and take measurements from that. That actually is a good idea, even if you're doing something for yourself, because as we start to talk about ease and sizing, etc., you'll already have a leg up to know where and what fit you enjoy and are comfortable with. Accurate measurements for designing sweaters and for knitting sweaters is an absolute must. So our next step is to get the measurements of whoever it is that you're designing the sweater for. I have asked my husband to stand in as my model. I thought if I actually showed us taking measurements, it would be a lot easier than trying to describe it. The first and most important measurement is the bust or chest. You want it to be around the fullest portion. And take a deep breath in. And I happen to know that's his jacket size, so we're good. On a female, in my case, I would take it across the fullest portion of my chest. I also like to take it above where my breasts are. In my case, when I like my sweaters to be a little bit more fitted, and so that somewhere between there is usually the greatest spot for me. I have found that if I go with just the largest portion of my chest, that I end up with a sweater that is a little bit too big for me. So that's another measurement on yourself or a female that is important. The next measurement you'll need is the waist. You want to go with a natural indentation. So it'd be right about there. And then you want to go with the hips, the widest portion of the hips. Now, I am not writing these down because I have all his measurements written down, but you should be recording these as you do it. So this is the widest portion of his hips. You don't have keys in that pocket, do you?
No.
Okay, I'm not taking measurements of keys. Okay, the next measurement is the arm length. So you want to go from the top of the shoulder to the base of the wrist, about where your wrist and arm meet. Oh, that's true. Wrist and hand. Thank you, honey. You'll also want to take the widest portion, stop it, widest portion of the upper arm and the wrist measurement. And then around the widest part where the bone is. Then you'll want to take can you raise your arm? You'll want to take a measurement from the base of the armpit, armhole, down to where he or she would like to have their sweater hit. I happen to know that he likes his sweaters right around here, and so that is one of the numbers. That's the number I would record. Oh, Jax, do you want us to measure you too, honey? The next measurement, out please. The next measurement would be from that same spot to the top of the shoulder, and that would give you approximately how wide the armhole would need to be. Obviously, we'll make it a little bit bigger than that, but that's the minimum that you need. And the last measurement for the sweater is the back shoulder. So you want to go from the shoulder all the way across to the other one and record that to make sure you have enough space back there as well. I have a sheet for each member of my family that I have recorded not only the measurements that we have just demonstrated, but also head size, hand size, foot length, etc. So if I want to knit something, I pretty much just go to that, and then periodically I can update it if that's necessary. In addition, another trick for this is, if, say, I wanted to knit a sweater for my husband, one of the things besides measuring him is I may ask him for a sweater that he really enjoys, that he puts it on and it just fits him the way he really likes it. And you can record those measurements as well. Not only will that tell you you're in the ballpark with what you've just done, but in addition, the next video we'll be talking about ease, etc. How much bigger than your body measurements do you want something to be? So that would give you an indication if that person likes to have them looser, fitted, etc. Next is yarn. This is the fun part, where you get to choose what it is that you wish to knit this with. As far as like a cable knit and an Aran sweater, we've all seen them in the undyed cream color, and I absolutely love them. So that's a traditional way to go if you choose. However, I have knit them in other colors, grays. This one is going to be a bright blue. For me, this was easy because not only have I used this yarn before, so I'm very familiar with how it's going to behave, but my son chose it. He loves soft yarn. And so I knew that if it was going to be a wool or scratchy, he would absolutely not wear it. I also knew that if I went with straight wool, that it is definitely not going to go to the dry cleaner. Everything goes in the washer. So I knew that it was going to have to be something that was an easy care type of a material. There are so many different yarns out there to choose from. This yarn here is Knit Picks Swish. It is a worsted weight. It is very, very soft. And let's talk a little bit about how to figure out how much yarn that you need to buy. So you'll have an idea if the person's small, medium, or extra large, plus size, etc. So right there, that tells you something. There are two things that I always think about with cable knitting. I always make sure I have more versus less, because cables take up more yarn than just straight stockinette knitting, etc. With all the crossing of the cables and the stitches and things, it just is usually 20% more yarn than is normal. So a rule that I follow always for pretty much anything that I knit, but definitely for sweaters, is I always purchase more yarn than I think I'm going to need. I do that for several reasons. Number one, I do not want to play yarn chicken at the end of a sweater and run out, because the likelihood, although it does happen with the blessing of the internet, finding a skein of yarn in the same dye lot that you had is extremely difficult. So then you have to make different design choices or pull it back and try and figure out something. If I end up with more yarn, I can always knit a hat to match the sweater, or mittens, or something else. And heaven knows I have plenty of projects on going all the time anyway. So for that reason, I do that. A lot of stores, and if you're buying this at your local yarn store, will let you return if you've purchased too much, as long as it's in good shape and a full skein. That's something that you would need to ask about when you purchase the yarn. Another resource for quantity of yarn is the person helping you at the yarn store. They're very knowledgeable about different yarns, and I'm sure would be very happy to help. In the case of this is a 50-gram skein. The examples that I'm going to give you here are 100-gram skeins. For worsted weight yarn in a size small, which would probably be like around a 36, 38, etc., I would purchase 7 to 9 yards. 7 to 9 skeins, I'm sorry. A medium, which would be 42, 44, 9 to 11. Large, 11 to 13, which would be 48 plus. And then extra large over that, I would 15 plus skeins of yarn. So it's not an inexpensive proposition to make a sweater, but it is so satisfying and such a beautiful gift for a loved one. In my case, on this one, I purchased 20 skeins of this. And as I said, this is 50 grams each, and I know that he's going to be an extra large. And so I'm hoping that I guessed correctly on this. The next thing we're going to chat about a little bit is gauge swatch, and that will give you more information. And if it turns out you need more yarn right away, sometimes you'll be okay getting some versus waiting and see how far you get on your sweater. Okay, now let's get to doing a little bit of knitting with the dreaded gauge swatch. So I have to be honest, and there are times that I do not knit a gauge swatch. However, this would not be one of them. If I'm designing a sweater, the numbers from the gauge swatch are part of what are going to drive how big the sweater is going to be and where it's going, etc. There are times where I'm very familiar with a yarn that I don't swatch And there's been times that I've gotten away with it, and there's been times where I've ended up with a sweater that was too big or too small, and or figuring it out as I go, and then you have to frog it and it's just a mess. So gauge swatches, even though they're not the most fun thing in the world, I usually put on some music or a book on tape, or I should not call books on tapes anymore, Audible, and a book online, and I knit away. So to start with, the label of the yarn that you've chosen has a lot of great information for the start of the gauge swatch and the beginning of your design journey. On the back of this, it will show you the recommended needles for the yarn, recommended crochet hook. It will talk about what it's made of, how to take care of it, washing instructions, etc. And in this case, mine is 100% fine superwash merino wool. So that tells me he is going to be able to throw it into the washer. I'm hoping it doesn't go in the dryer, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. The next thing it tells me is, in this case for knitting, number 6 to number 9 needles should give me 4.5 to 5 stitches per inch. That's where I start with my gauge swatch. I am looking for several things when I knit a gauge swatch. I am trying to get gauge in some cases. That's important with the design process, but because you're designing with the numbers, the measurements from whoever you're knitting the sweater for, and also your gauge swatch, you'll be designing it to the gauge that you choose after you've done your gauge swatch. So it's different than when you're trying to get gauge for a pattern knit by somebody else. So keep that in mind. How I knit my gauge swatches are, I cast on 30 stitches. This is my gauge swatch. As you can see from here, as I said, I've worked with this before, so I kind of have an idea of what this yarn is going to do. However, I still did the gauge swatch because it doesn't mean that today my gauge is what it was the last time I did it. So when I knit a gauge swatch, I cast on 30 stitches with the needles that I am going to use. So remember back when we talked about tools, how do you know what needles that you need to get? Start by looking at the yarn that you've chosen and get those needles. Then go down a little bit, because for your ribbing, your neckline, etc., we're going to use a smaller needle, usually 1 to 2 sizes smaller. Cast on 30 stitches. I do 4 rows of garter, which is knit back and forth. I then knit 3 stitches in the garter stitch, then I knit across 27 and then knit 3 stitches. The reason that I do the garter borders is because stockinette wants to roll naturally, and it makes it hard to, it's not impossible, it's just harder to measure when the yarn wants to roll up on you. And so I have just over time found, if I'm going to spend the time doing the gauge swatch and I want it to be accurate, that is how I do it. I then knit down probably about 30 rows, and then with 1 size needle, I would start, in this case, I started with a number 6 needle. Then I break the next time, when I'm ready to go up to the next size, I go to the number 7 needle and I knit 4 rows of garter, and then continue in the same way until I get to the end. If I was going to go to a size 8 after that, I'd do the same thing. Knit 4 rows of garter, keep going for another 30 rows, and then bind off. The next thing that you need to do with this is, I usually take a look at it at that time and see where I'm at, do a few measurements and stuff, but then I wash it. Now in this case, a lot of times I just hand wash them. In this case, knowing that it's going to go into the washing machine, I did this in the washing machine, and then I did hand dry it, and I blocked it out, not aggressively, because I want it to be what it's going to do naturally, and let it dry. And then from there on, we're ready to start taking some measurements of our stitches and our rows. Okay, my suggestion for you is to choose your yarn and 3 sizes of needles and get your gauge swatch done with the garter stitch between. Actually, one of the things that I forgot to mention is I heard a great tip. I don't typically do it. I haven't yet, but how do you remember this is size 6, this is size 7 needles? Somebody made the suggestion of knitting or purling a number of stitches. So in other words, if this is size 6, somewhere on the edge, not right next to where you're doing the garter, you won't be able to tell, but somewhere on the edge, do 6 purl stitches, so you will always know that this was number 6 needle. And same thing with this number 7 needle. I have not tried that yet, but I thought that was a great tip. I typically I have these little things attached to light bulb markers that are 6, 7, 8, and I usually put it on that. However, when I'm done with it and I take it off, then I'm back to, I don't know, I don't know which one I did other than, with my notes. So get your tools together, get your yarn, get your gauge swatch done, and in about 2 weeks we'll be back together and we'll be doing sweater math and beginning to design our sweater. So we'll figure out the measurements that you took for the person that you're knitting the sweater for and the measurements from the gauge swatch, and we will put all that together to begin to design our sweater and figure out where we're at. In the meantime, also, please always give me a message back on this. If you have any questions whatsoever, I am very, very happy to help. And as I said, in about 2 weeks, I will have video number 2 of our design along journey. And I'm looking forward to seeing what everybody is going to be using for your yarn and getting started on this beautiful journey together. In the meantime, stay cozy and crafty, and I will see you in a few weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.